Thank you. Thank you so much. It's very good to be with you tonight. And it's especially enjoyable that I get to share this talk that is kind of a landmark for me. I counted up the years and was shocked to discover that I've been teaching for about 30 years. That would be 3 decades. That makes me feel old. But then again, all my children are grown. I have 10 grandchildren with one on the way, so I suppose 30 years isn't bad. I titled the talk, However Imperfectly, Lessons from 30 Years of Teaching, because as I reflect back, that's kind of the thing that most comes to me, is the imperfectness of it. And yet we always do the best we can. And so I thought I would share with you these 7 things. I could have 20, but that would take way too long. So we've compressed it to 7 things that I have learned, and hopefully it will be of interest or of use to you and others. The first thing that I learned, it was one of the first lessons really, was it's hard not to do to your children what was done to you. I went to public schools in Southern California, and so my experience for 12 years of public education essentially was, that's what school is. That's what you bring into adulthood. That's what school is, what was done to you. And so then you come into teaching, either your own children or other people's children, and you start to say, well, that's what I should do, what was done to me, without being able to stop and ask the question, was that a good thing that was done to me? And I had my first little dose of reality in 1990. I was teaching violin. Never imagined at that time that I would be teaching writing or traveling around and having a business like IEW. Just a little violin teacher in Bozeman, Montana, trying to eke out a living teaching music. And one of my students' parents gave me a book called Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Education by John Taylor Gatto. Is anyone familiar with John Taylor Gatto? If you're not, he's worth a read. He's a fascinating man. He taught English in Brooklyn, New York for 16 years. And he was the New York State Teacher of the Year twice, New York City Teacher of the Year, a couple of other awards. And when he received his last Teacher of the Year award, he gave a little speech where he basically said, this system is totally dysfunctional. What 13-year-olds need is exactly the opposite of what we do to them. I have only become the Teacher of the Year by not only breaking all the rules, but also doing things which were technically illegal, like sneaking kids out of school in the middle of the day so they could go have meaningful experiences. And by the way, I quit. This was probably good timing on his part. And he wrote a little article for the Wall Street Journal called I Quit, I Think. And it kind of went viral. And then he wrote this book, Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Education. And I read this book at the age of 30 in 1990. And I thought to myself, yes, this explains why I am so stupid. I don't know, did anyone have that experience around 30-something? You kind of realize, I'm supposed to be grown up now, and I am profoundly ignorant about almost everything. Did anyone have that feeling? And it's kind of frustrating. It's like, I thought, wow, there's so many things I don't know, and maybe it isn't entirely my own fault. The problem with Gatto, and then he ended up writing another book called The Underground History of American Education. The problem with reading his books is, although they are enlightening, they're also kind of depressing, because he looks at the system and says, well, it's profoundly broken, it's not what it should be, and there's no way to fix it, so quit, like I did. He doesn't have the answer to the question, well, if that's what you shouldn't do, what should you do? And so that began for me kind of the pursuit of the question of what should I do as a teacher, as a parent, and educating and trying to navigate this world of teaching. So that was the first lesson, and it set me on that path of looking for those things that started to come to me and make a difference and help me understand better. I ultimately got a few other books that were much more helpful, or at least cheerful, and set out on the path that has brought me to where I am here today. So that's the first lesson. It's hard to not do to your own students what was done to you. And then once you realize that, you kind of are holding a Jell-O mold, you know, like you've been poured into this mold, you've been solidified, the mold is gone, but you hold the shape. So how do we break that shape, and how do we then have the freedom to restructure and relook at different ways of doing things? The second lesson that I learned is the idea that it's more about process than product. This is kind of an extension off the first one, because the public schools seem to be, at least my experience, is that they're very much about product. So what's the goal of going to class? To get a good grade so that you get a good score on your transcript so that you can get to a good college and have a good life. And that product is illusory. Also, I feel that we all are very attached to this idea that it's what we've got right now that we can prove our value. I mean, schools are like that. Now we see the influx of a new wave of excitement about standards and standardized tests that prove that the school is meeting these standards. And there's some value to having standards and goals, but I think we can too easily become a little obsessed and forget that the effort of the day is sufficient thereof, and that the product is in the distance, it's not in the moment. There is a great scene from a movie which I think everyone should watch just the 2 minutes of this movie. The rest of it I would pass on. You might remember it. It's getting old now. But it's A River Runs Through It. Anyone see that movie? It's mostly about fly fishing in Montana, which is perhaps why I found it tedious. Also kind of depressing. Brad Pitt dies, which I suppose, for some people is a good thing. But it's the biography, it's the movie made from the autobiography of Norman Maclean, the American author. So in the beginning of the movie, there's this very excellent scene where there's a very young Norman Maclean, probably, 10 years old, and he's sitting there writing some composition of some sort at his little table, and he finishes and he takes it into his father, who is a very taciturn Scottish Presbyterian minister, essentially homeschooling two boys out in the middle of nowhere in Montana in the early part of the 1900s. And he slides it across his father's desk. His father writes on it a little bit and then slides it back to him and says, again, half as long. So he goes back to his little table and he starts writing this thing again, and then he brings it in and he slides it across to his father, and his father marks it up and slides it back across the table and says, again, shorter. So he goes back to his little table and he writes this thing a third time, which for any of you who've dealt with 10-year-old boys and rewrites, this in itself is remarkable, but he writes it a third time. He comes in, brings it to his father, slides it across the desk. The father looks at it and slides it back across the desk and says, good, now throw it away. And the boy takes the paper, crumples it up into a ball, hits the trash can with a two-pointer, grabs his fishing pole, runs out the door, and his mother yells, Norman, wait for your brother. Of course, some people, moms in particular, kind of cringe at that, now throw it away. It's like, throw it away. He worked on that. He rewrote that a third time. You're going to throw it away? I mean, couldn't we at least put it in a portfolio and prove that we did something? But the lesson is invaluable, and that is it's the process, not the product. The product is the artifact of what happened. But let's think, objectively, the writing of a 10-year-old child is worthless. Honestly, unless you happen to have a genius prodigy, for the most part, you're going to throw it away eventually. Why not do it now? But the truth of the lesson, what's being communicated in the lesson, is that it's all about what was learned that day, not the artifact and whether it remains or not, but the learning of the day is sufficient thereof. And I think we can all glean some value from understanding this, that we don't get too attached with the product. You know, I teach writing, work with teachers and parents who teach writing, and there's always the problem of, but what do you do about fill in the blank, right? What do you do about this problem that this child is demonstrating that makes their writing less than what you wish it would be, less than perfect? Well, the fact is it's never going to be perfect. Someday it may be better than what you or I could write, but not in the near future probably. So what do? You follow probably Dr. Suzuki's idea, which is the 1-point lesson. You know, pick one thing, focus on that, teach at the point of need, as Mrs. Ingham used to say all the time, and don't worry about the whole. Don't worry about the product, look at the process. The second subpoint under this process, not product, would be what I learned about the how being more important than the what. I am convinced now that how we learn something is more important than what we learn. I think we all have the experience of having been to a class, say pick a random class in high school. For me it would be biology, right? I took biology in high school. I got an A. I have an A on my high school transcript to prove that, but I really never learned any biology. What happened is I was blessed with a good enough memory to be able to hold biology information in my mind just long enough to pass a test with a decent score. And as soon as that was done, then you could forget it for a while. Maybe you had to review it a little bit for a semifinal or a final exam. But I'm pretty sure that a short time after that class was over, the amount of information that I experienced in that class that still remained in my brain, 5%, maybe 2%. So I spent an entire year sitting in class every day, successfully not learning a whole lot of biology. Why? Why? Because I didn't care. I had no engagement. There was no relevance in this for me. I found the teacher tedious and uninspiring, and I learned how to play the game of get a good grade in school. But the learning wasn't real. It didn't stick. Who else can remember a class or classes or many classes of that? So what I came to realize is that the things that we choose to learn about, the way we learn them is more lasting, right? And you think about the things you learned in childhood that you brought into adulthood, and usually you connect them with a more meaningful experience, either an inspiring teacher or activities that brought it to life or some kind of relevance for that thing and you. And so that the how we learn, and as an extrapolation, how we teach, is more important than what we learn or what we teach. And yet we do tend to get caught up with curriculum, don't we? You know, we have this problem of a transcript and it has to have all these classes and we have to fill this thing out to prove that we learned something. I'm not sure a transcript actually proves you learned anything. More like it proves you did time, right? I mean, you spent time doing stuff, but what did you take out of school into your adult life, having really learned it? And so to contemplate that and think about that idea of how are our students learning, that's what's going to last. Because when you attend to that, what they're learning is how to learn, the experience of learning, the development, the cognitive development. That's what you take more than just the facts or the information and the experience or even the skills that may evaporate. The third sub-point under this process versus product is a quote from a good friend of mine, Andrew Kern, who said one time to me, "Understanding is highly overrated." And I thought, that's not right. And then I thought, no, that's true. And you know, we continued the conversation that statement started. But you know, there's a lot of things we don't understand. nor are we likely to ever understand them fully. I do not understand Shakespeare. Does that mean it's not worth reading, not worth studying, not worth talking about, not worth memorizing or acting out? No, there's tremendous value, even if you never understand it thoroughly. It also reminds me of a humorous quote by Mark Twain. He said, to paraphrase, he said, it's not the parts of the Bible that I don't understand that bother me. It's the things that are perfectly clear that cause me concern. But we can do all sorts of things, and if we're doing something really worth doing, we probably won't fully understand it. We can read classics, we can read great books, we can read simple poems, we can listen and talk and learn and realize that it's all part of a process. It's not as though, aha, I now fully understand Shakespeare or this play or any part of this play. And so we kind of have to give up that attachment, right? But I don't understand it. Well, maybe that's good. Maybe that means you keep thinking, keep asking, keep talking. The corollary to that would be the fourth point under process versus product. And this is a quote from one of my favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton. Any Chesterton fans out there? So Chesterton said something kind of enigmatic. He said a lot of things that were enigmatic, but this one kind of bothers people. It says, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. Now, that sounds bad, like we're going to do something and we're going to do it badly, and that's okay. I don't think he necessarily meant don't strive for excellence. What I think he meant probably was anything worth doing is worth doing imperfectly. Because we can't do everything perfectly. We may be able to do nothing perfectly. And so if we are afraid of doing something imperfectly or badly, we might do nothing at all. So we have to take the plunge. We have to jump in. We have to be willing to say, I'll give it my best because it's worth doing. I'll give you an example of something I have done very badly for the past many years. Teach Latin. So when we moved to Oklahoma, it corresponded with a event I went to where I heard one of my great friends, now deceased, but a great mentor, Cheryl Lowe, who gave a talk called The Top 10 Reasons for Teaching Latin. And I walked out of that talk and I was very disturbed because I thought, oh no, I have to do this. If I don't do this, nobody else is going to do it. And if I don't do it for my children and other people's children, they won't get it. And there's these 10 awesome reasons why they have to learn Latin. I mean, I was fully convicted. It was almost a religious level of conviction. The only problem was I didn't know Latin. And I knew there's no one else to do it. So I just said, okay, we're going to start a Latin class. And I had 23 students between the ages of 10 and 17 inclusive in one room twice a week. And we did first form Latin. And I desperately tried to stay 2 lessons ahead of the students. And of course, they would ask me questions, and I could not possibly answer these questions. But I would say, well, I cannot answer this question, but I will try to find out. And then I would quickly email Cheryl Lowe, whose fault it is that I was in this fix. And fortunately, she was very gentle, and she answered my stupid questions with great gentleness. If I had been maybe able to stay 10 or 15 lessons ahead of the students, but the problem was I had to do all the worksheets and study twice or 3 times as long as these kids, because I'm 50 years old and they've got these powerful absorbent brains, and I'm having to do double duty just to keep my nose above the water. You've been there. You understand. And so then, we got through the year. Everybody finished first form Latin, and then the next year, I thought, well, we're not giving up. I'm going to have to keep going. I don't know where we're going, but we're going to, I'm going to get the flashlight and stay 2 steps ahead. And so we did second form, lost a couple, gained a couple students, still had 20-some students in this group, and we all made it through second year. And I'm getting up early to study Latin. My poor family's thinking, what is his obsession? And then the third year, we were in the third year, it was starting to get more interesting. And then I took my top student and I forced her to start a new first year Latin for all the younger siblings, because I was convinced every child needs to learn Latin. It's just, there's no debate on the issue. Kept going. Finally, the fifth year, I took my next student down, top student, and forced her to start a new first year Latin class, because we had all these younger siblings coming in. I had no idea what I was doing, honestly. But I knew one thing. It was important, it was worth doing, and consequently is worth doing very imperfectly. And I recently had a point of vindication, because for some reason it's your own children that complain more about stuff than other people's children complain to you. Maybe they complain to their parents, I don't know. But one of my children, unnamed, recently said to me, well, it's hard to say this to you, Dad, but I'm really grateful for Latin. It's making my college level Spanish studies so much easier. Yes, vindicated at last. It's such a good feeling. So don't be afraid. If you feel called, if you believe there's value in teaching something, whether you think you're the best person to do it or not, have faith, jump in, take the plunge, stay 2 or 3 steps ahead of your students, because if it's worth doing, it's worth doing, period. So those are the 4 points under process versus product. The next point is this, and it's so self-evident. You say this and everybody laughs, or they should if they're paying attention, but it's kind of obvious that everybody knows, so why even say it? But it needs to be said, and that is this: all kids are different. Right? And no one would deny this fact. No human being would deny that, and yet our educational system, by its structure, not necessarily the people in it or the teachers, but by its structure, it assumes that all kids are the same, because they have to start within a 9-month age range of each other, and they have to basically do the same thing according to the same schedule for their whole period, so they get a predictable, controllable product. And yet this never works. It never works. Give me any group of children, even if they were all born on exactly the same day, and what would you discover? You've got 2 or 3 or more grade levels of difference in, name it, reading, writing, math, whatever aptitude, whatever skills. So the idea that you can group people together closely based on age and then do the same thing with them all and expect it to work is fundamentally flawed. And yet that's part of what we tend to do. Why? Because that's what was done to us. That's part of the Jello mold paradigm, right? So how do we fight that? How do we work with that? It's tough. If you're teaching in a classroom, it's very tough, because you've got 3 grade levels of difference, and how do you teach at the point of need and challenge everyone appropriately and not have some of them get bored and the others, get lost? It's extremely difficult. So I don't envy, classroom teachers their job. I did it once, and it's such a hard job. You would have to be a saint. Otherwise, you go look for a better way to make money. You have to do it selfless because you love the children. And most teachers I know are well aware that the structure of the system is not helping them, that there's a disorder to it. But how do we break free? It's tough. In some forms of alternative education, you can do that. You have the cottage schools. You have kind of a variation on the one-room schoolhouse. You have homeschools. And so then you see that every child can kind of work differently at a different speed, and they can get as much or as little repetition as they need to stay engaged and also have mastery. But juggling all those balls is extremely difficult to do. And yet I do think that's kind of the ideal that we would work for. Some of you are familiar with my mentor, Dr. Webster. Dr. Webster started teaching right during the end of World War II in rural Saskatchewan. He finished high school, and he was 17 years old, but he was very tall. And so they hired him on thinking that he was older, not verifying his actual age, because there was a shortage of people to teach in the schools. And they said, you get to go to this town, and you get to teach this one-room schoolhouse of 40-some children by yourself, with no electricity. And several of your first graders are Eastern European refugees who don't speak English. Now, you would think this would be an awfully challenging situation. But he got in there, and what he noticed was that pretty much all the students could kind of work independently at their speed. And, you know, he could teach a class to the little few students that were in grade 5, and then the grade 6s would overhear what they heard once, and the grade 4s would hear what they're going to hear. And if someone had a problem, they'd go to an upper level student. So if a grade 5 student was working on something, math or spelling or writing, had a question, he'd go to a grade 8. Wouldn't bother the teacher. Teacher's very busy teaching, you know, all these different things to everybody. And yet there was this mix that some students could be kind of in the grade 4 group for math and kind of in the grade 5 group for reading or kind of in the grade 3 group for spelling. And there was this kind of like a huge homeschooling family. And that the students were always helping each other, that this was the normal for the environment. So anyway, he survived this year there, and then they told him, sorry, you're not qualified to be a teacher. You only took a 6-week summer training course. You now have to go to college and, you know, take a 2-year teacher training course. So he did, and then he taught grade 5, all the same age, all the same grade. He said, that was the hardest year of teaching, because if someone had a problem, they all had a problem, and they couldn't help each other, and there was no ability for them to review or go ahead. There was no flexibility in the system. It was very regimented. And he said that was the hardest year of teaching for him, because it was so different than what he was used to. So I don't know that we can solve this problem on an institutional basis, because the schools are very, very ingrained in age segregation. Once upon a time, being in grade 5 meant that you had passed and knew all the information and had the skills required to pass grade 4. And if you didn't, well, you could do grade 4 again. And this is, of course, how you got 15-year-olds who were still in grade 5. But it didn't really matter so much because of the one-room schoolhouse. Nobody was going anywhere anyway. But once you age segregated the kids and they shut down the one-room schoolhouses, then you had the problem of, oh no, if you're held back, then it's obvious. Your peers went ahead, you're held back, and this is going to be, you know, you deem yourself stupid, it makes it harder to learn everything, you get a negative attitude. And so it kind of evolved to a point where you would go to the next grade no matter what happened. Whether you mastered grade 4 content or not, you would go to the next grade by merit of being a year older. And so this is a difficult system to undo. We do see it in places. We see it obviously in the homeschool, we see it in the cottage school environment. I have been in schools that have mixed grade classrooms. But it's tough. One of the side effects of teaching everybody the same age and believing they're all going to be able to learn and do the same things is then we are forced to compare them with each other. And this does seep into the parents big time. You know, I have parents who will come up to me at a conference or something and say, well, you know, I just pulled my kids out of school and we're going to homeschool, and I have a 7th grader and a 5th grader and a 3rd grader, and I'm a little worried about, fill in the blank, my 7th grader. I'm afraid, I think he's behind in fill in the blank. Usually for me it's writing or English. My first question is, behind whom? Who are you comparing this to? Because there's this ideal, right? that nobody really can define. You keep getting new iterations of standards, but the language is so vague, you can't really know if you've ever met that. But there's this odd sense, because I'm comparing this child with other people's children who are approximately the same age, I must be failing, or this child is behind, or whatever. It's okay to be ahead. Nobody worries about that. Nobody ever came up and said, I'm very concerned, my child seems to be ahead of his peers, right? But to be behind, that's a stigma, and it can develop into a real, a real negative, even a fear that we carry around. So, I've tried to fight that so that children aren't comparing themselves based on age, and more importantly, that the teachers and parents aren't comparing themselves based on age. Because generally, when you do so, it leads to two things, both undesirable: pride or bitterness. That's the result of comparing yourself with other people. You say, oh, well, I'm better than that, but I'm worse than that, and so I'm good, or I'm failing. No, we're all who we are. We're all where we are. The only thing that really matters is, are we getting better compared to what we were, right? I can't compare myself to other Latin teachers, because then I would get depressed and give up, right? But I can compare myself to a year ago and say, aha, I know more, I understand it better, right? And it's the same thing in everything we do, and particularly with kids, and we evaluate them, we assess them. The real question is, are they improving according to where they were? Not where are they compared with someone else their age. See, my basic view is that of a music teacher. I do believe that all teachers would be better teachers if they were first music teachers. I actually think all presidents would be better presidents if they were first music teachers, and probably all congressmen would be better if they all played musical instruments as a prerequisite for getting elected. Then they could play some string quartets or a little chamber music before they get into negotiation. And anyway, silly dream. That gives CNN really something to report on, wouldn't it? World leaders play chamber music. Conflicts resolved. But here's why I think music teachers have a particularly valuable view on things. Number one, we don't care when someone starts playing music, right? I taught violin. You can start playing the violin when you're 4, or when you're 8, or when you're 14, or when you're 40. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when you start. It's not as, oh no, you're 9 years old. You missed your opportunity to become good at violin. That's ridiculous, ridiculous. So you can start at any age. There's no schedule, right? Another thing is that it doesn't matter how fast a student makes progress, right? It doesn't matter whether you get through book 1 in 6 weeks or 2 years. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you get through book 1, and when you get to the end, you play all the pieces well. That's what matters. The other thing I have never done as a music teacher is give grades. That wouldn't make any sense at all. What do? Go to the recital, you watch your students play, keep your little report card there. Ha ha, missed the C sharp. A minus. Ooh, bad rhythm, B plus. Ha, major memory lapse, C. I mean, what would be the point? There would be no motivational value whatsoever. And I am not convinced that grades are an effective way to motivate students. Probably there's a few that believe they're motivated by grades, but I suspect they could be motivated in other ways as well. But I know there's a lot of students who get demotivated because you start to get a bad grade and you think, well, I'm not good at this. And if there's one thing you don't want to do, it's something you believe you're not good at, right? You want to avoid doing that. You want to do something else. It's part of the 3 laws of motivation. Children, they like to do what they can do, right? So if you're good at something, you like doing it. If you're good at cooking, you like cooking. If you're good at soccer, you like playing soccer. if you're not good at soccer, you don't like playing soccer. And kids are just like this too. And so they will tend to do better at what they feel they're good at. So when you start to grade and start to get a bad grade, you say, well, I'm bad at this. Why bother doing it? Right? I'll suffer through and get a passing score so I don't get punished or yelled at, but I'm never going to be good. So I'm not sure that grades really do anything useful. But as a music teacher, you are free. You do not have to ever give grades. You don't have to compare children with other children. You don't say, oh no, this 8-year-old is behind in the sequence of music or plays worse than this other 8-year-old. Nobody would do that. Do you see? So I think if you can grasp the music teacher mentality, it doesn't matter when you start. It doesn't matter who else is doing it and what they're doing it like. You don't have to use artificial means to reward or punish. And you can motivate all students to continue to do their best. It's hard work, but it's possible. And then we could be free. We could have a much more wholesome system. And I think a true assessment model would be based on, is the student better than when they started? So one of the things I recommend to teachers who teach writing in classrooms is on the first day of the year, give your student a little piece of, give them some paper and give them a little assignment, just some random thing. Write about an animal, write about your home, write about a friend. And let them just flounder around for 20 minutes, and when time's up, collect them all. Don't read them. Stick them in an envelope, seal it, right? And then teach for the whole year. And then at the end of the year, give them some paper and the exact same assignment with the exact same amount of time, and then pull the ones out that you never looked at, give them back to the students and say, here's you. This was you at the beginning, this was you at the end. That's a true type of assessment. And most all the time, the kids themselves are like, wow, I got better. This is better. And that's motivating. Do you see? And the fourth subpoint under all kids are different, and that is this. All kids are brain injured. I know that's a harsh saying. I said this once at a keynote for a special needs conference. I said, every sibling would be a better sibling, and every parent would be a better parent, and every teacher would be a better teacher, and every administrator would be a better administrator, and every legislator would be a better legislator. Everyone would be better if everyone had a brain-injured child in their family. Why? Well, instantly you'd become more compassionate, and that would be huge. Love would expand, sacrifice would expand, but in addition, you would realize you can't compare this child with other children, and you could be free of the compelling need to do that, especially based on age. And then I said, and the good news is everybody has a brain-injured child. Not just you who are at a special needs conference, but all of us. Because think about it. On one end of the spectrum is neurologically flawless. On the other end is comatose. Everybody's somewhere in between. It's just a matter of location and degree. And so some kids exhibit difficulties with speech or autistic tendencies or dysgraphic or whatever the issue, right? And then, but nobody's perfect. So then you realize, okay, we're all just flawed. And when we understand that, and then we say, okay, so it's a matter of location and degree. How do we help this child be the best that they can be without comparing them? It's so freeing. The fourth point is that progressive does not necessarily mean progress. The word is, in a way, misappropriated, particularly when applied to education. So you will hear this term, progressive education, as though we're making progress. But we're not. It's very objectively true that things have been getting worse, right? By all measures, test scores are down. And if we look at our area, which is writing in particular, it is profoundly bleak. In fact, in 1990, now do the math here. How long ago was 1990? 27 years. In 1990, Myra Linden wrote a book called Why Johnny Can't Write. This was part of the Why Johnny Can't Do Anything series. But in this book, she documented very well with primary sources research that indicated the writing skills of high school and college students, high school graduates in particular, had been in continuous decline for 20 years. 20 years. That was in 1990. I don't know a single person who's going to argue that things are better now than they were 27 years ago. So that's 47 years. That's almost 50 years of continuous decline in the writing skills of American high school students. So whatever we've been doing for the past 50 years is probably not progress, even though we call it progressive, right? So what do you do with that? Well, you think about, I believe it was Einstein who gets credited with the definition of insanity is to keep doing what you've always been doing, but expect different results. So keep walking down the pathway, but expect something else. You could use the other tack and say, what did they do before things were getting worse? That would be a common sense question, wouldn't it? And you would go back and you could study that. And you could say, well, maybe we should imitate some of the systems or some of the methods that people were using to teach kids before things started to get worse. You could actually go all the way back to ancient times. You could go back to Homer and discover in the Iliad, Phoenix, who is the teacher of Achilles, says, your father charged me to teach you, essentially, depending on your translation, what to do and how to speak. In other words, morals and thinking. What to do, morals, and how to speak or how to think, right? So what do we do now? We kind of do the opposite. We don't teach what to do whatever you want, and we don't necessarily teach how to speak or how to write or how to think. George Orwell wrote 1984 and gave a great picture of what happens when people don't think. He summed it up in one little sentence. He says, if people can't write, they can't think. And if people can't think, others will do their thinking for them. So what do we see? Well, we see now a modern kind of obsession with STEM technology, right? This is what will rescue America. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Although recently I heard it's better. STEAM technology. Can you guess what that is? Science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. So someone got that in that acronym, and it's just really forced, isn't it? I mean, we have to put art between engineering and mathematics so that we can spell STEAM. But there is a problem with what's going on in the science and technology. Now, I'm all for science and technology. We look at the trivium, we see the language arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. We see the quadrivium, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music. These are the arts of learning. But what we see, the modern application has become, in many cases, an obsession with technology. If we don't teach kids how to use computers, they won't be able to get a job. All you have to do is look around and notice. Kids learn how to use technology much faster than their parents, without any direct instruction, right? You can actually try to prevent your children from having access to technology, and they will still figure it out faster than you do. So I feel there's two things that are very dangerous now, and it's easy, again, for us to kind of fall into this trap and push this technology. One is the idea that we need to start younger and younger, right? So we need, if you go to a big teachers conference, you'll notice that most of the exhibits no longer are curriculum. Most of the exhibits, and the biggest ones, are all technology. The drive toward the paperless classroom. Let's get pads and tablets into the hands of third graders, second graders, first graders, and that this is somehow going to improve their basic skills. The truth is pretty evident. It will not improve. In fact, almost all the research indicates it will cause a decline in basic skills. In fact, there's a book, it's a little dated now, it was written back in the early 2000s, It's called The Flickering Mind, The False Promise of Technology in Education. And Oppenheimer, who wrote this book, he spent a year traveling the country looking at high-tech schools and low-tech schools and middle-tech schools and evaluating what's happening in schools and classrooms. And he found almost an exact inverse correlation on the amount of technology and the quality of basic skills. The more technology in the school, the lower the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic calculation. The lower the technology, the higher the skills. North Carolina just put out a little thing in the news that said kids who don't have computers at home score better on tests than ones who do. That didn't make any sense at all. And in parts of Europe now, they're looking at schools as technology-free zones for the salvation of their children, right? So they're at home, they're constantly surrounded. They go to school to be free of this for a while. Oppenheimer found a couple of very interesting things, and they're in this book. You can read it if you like. It's called The Flickering Mind. One funny little story is he interviewed the president of Sun Microsystems, which is a big, successful computer company in that time. This man went to a Waldorf school, which was 12 years of zero technology. And they don't even use textbooks. They write their own textbooks, right? So they said, how is it that you went to zero technology for your whole childhood and you became the founder of a very successful technology company? This was his answer. He said, in 5th grade, we had to knit a pair of socks. If you can knit a pair of socks, you can do anything. Talking about problem solving, right? But in the end, he points out this. He says technology essentially amplifies whatever you have. So if you have productive, organized, efficient people and you give them technology, they will become more productive, more efficient, and more organized. If you have inefficient, unproductive, and disorganized people and you give them technology, they will become more disorganized, inefficient, and unproductive. And he leaves the reader with the question, what's a typical 10-year-old like? So it's an interesting approach. But today we see, I think, a more insidious view coming, and that is not that technology could interfere with the development of basic skills, but even more so that knowing stuff is not important. Having the basic skills is not important. Why bother teaching children to write on paper if everybody in the world just types everything? Why bother teaching them to type when they can talk to their device? Why bother teaching spelling when spell checkers will correct everything? Maybe. There's even the attitude, believe it or not, why have children learn math facts like basic multiplication when they can just have a calculator? What's the point? There's a man I met a couple years ago at the Global Home Education Conference, and I had never come face to face with this before. So to me, it was somewhat of a shock. He's very well known. His name is Sugata Mitra. He was in India a professor of astrophysics, but since that doesn't pay very well, he was teaching computer programming to rich people's children, which paid better, I suppose, than theoretical physics, I think it was. And he got this idea that these kids in the slum who had no access to computers or anything might be just as smart as the kids of the rich people he was teaching. So he put a little kiosk in the slum, put in a computer with filtered internet access, and just let the kids essentially teach themselves. And what he discovered was that these kids could teach themselves all sorts of things. One of the amazing things is they figured out how to use Windows. But no, they were teaching themselves even English so they could use and learn, and they learned how to search, and they were excited about learning because they had no access to this type of thing. And so he tried this experiment again in a different slum. He put a little kiosk out in the rural part of the country, and he ended up winning the $1 million TED Talk award for the best TED Talk because it was so exciting. This propelled him into the world of higher education, I guess, for reals. And he ended up moving to England. He teaches at Newcastle University in England. He's a professor of education technology. Okay, so that's the background. So it's very interesting. You listen to his TED Talk, and you're like, that is very interesting. And he spoke at this conference, and I spoke at this conference, and it was interesting because we both had essentially the same first half of our talk, which is the traditional system is dysfunctional, it's mechanical, it's for an industrial age. His PowerPoint was better than mine, I must confess. But then it took a very different tack. He said, my colleagues who teach at the university don't want their students to use their phone during examinations. And I say, why don't you want them to use their phone during examinations? And they say, because they would answer every question. And I respond, don't you want them to answer every question? So now that's a little bit of a paradigm adjustment. But he kept going with this, and he said, you know, technology isn't going to go away. In fact, this phone will continue to shrink until it disappears into our body. And we will have continuous access to the ever-growing database of infinite knowledge. So decades from now, our grandchildren will ask us, great-grandchildren probably, what's driving? And we will try to explain that once upon a time we had to get in a car and we had to control the wheel and push pedals and watch where we're going in order to operate a car to go somewhere. And they will say, you're kidding. Same thing will happen. They will ask us, what's learning? And we will explain that we used to have to try and know stuff and remember stuff rather than access it. And they will say, you're kidding. That's when it got spooky. That's when it was pretty clear he did not know his audience. I, of course, took the other tack, which is let's go back to the way it was before industrial education. So it was an interesting comparison. But I had never come face to face with this idea that, you know, technology will mesh with mankind. And I asked a friend of mine who is an actual trained philosopher, I said, Martin, you know, we have these ages, right? You had the Renaissance, and then you had the Enlightenment, and then you had the modern age, and now, you know, we're kind of in the postmodern age. That's what people call it. What comes after postmodern? He said, well, people have already labeled this posthuman. That we're moving into the posthuman age where humanity is malleable and we will blend with technology. But here's the fundamental problem. Aside from the fact that it denies the nature of what human means in humanity, it's okay if you ask your phone, Siri, when was the Civil War? And Siri tells you when the Civil War was. You don't have to know that anymore because you can always ask your phone. The problem, though, is if you take this to an extreme and say children shouldn't have to know or memorize anything, at some point you won't even be able to ask the question because you won't even know there was a Civil War. So the ability to think, to ask the questions, will have shrunk to the point where no one knows anything. And then what happens? People are very easily controlled, right? Thomas Jefferson, I believe, said if a people hopes to remain ignorant but free, they're hoping for something that never has been and never will be, to paraphrase. I have a friend. She actually was one of our exhibitors a while back. She homeschooled her boys and girl. She had a girl, and they all went off and did very well. And so she went back, as many homeschool graduate moms do, to work a little bit. And she was a teacher, had her certificate, so she decided to go back, and she got a job substitute teaching in a wealthy suburb of Chicago, so not an inner city school by any means. And so she got in a math class in 7th grade, and she was horrified because she told me, there wasn't one student in the whole class who could do a single math problem of any sort at their level without a calculator. Her children didn't even get to know that calculators existed until they were, juniors and seniors, upper level, where you need trigonometric functions or something. One of her sons went off to get a master's in mathematics. But she was horrified because what happens? If you don't just know math facts, you can never think mathematically, right? If you don't know that 6 times 7 is 42, what do you do when you see a 42? You can't look into it. You can't see the truth of it. And how will you ever do factoring or fractions or anything? You can't really use the calculator unless, again, you know the right question to ask it. And so I think we're careening headlong, and it's very possible that in the institutions in particular, especially the ones that are very aggressively throwing technology into the early grades, the damage done will be so serious it will be too late to rescue. So, I have tried to understand the proper use of technology in teaching, and we all have, and it's not something that we would eliminate completely, like let's be our own little Waldorf school, although sometimes I am tempted. But what's the place for it? Point number 5, college and career readiness isn't. Okay, you've heard of the College Board, the people who own and administer the SAT and the CLEP tests and the AP exams. So they have a charming little document called the Test Specifications for the Redesigned SAT. You can download this for free, and you might like to read it if either you suffer from insomnia or you would like to get angry. It's good for those two things as far as I can tell. But they have these buzzwords, college and career readiness. But I've tried this experiment many times. Let's pretend, do a little thought experiment with you here. Let's pretend that you are a college or university teacher, and you get to teach high school graduates, freshmen. Or, on the other hand, you are a business owner or a manager who gets to hire high school graduates. Okay, so you're one of those two people in your mind right now. So now you shout out and you tell me some things that you would like these high school graduates to have when they come to you, either as students or employees. What would you like? Shout out. Enthusiasm. Communication skills. Show up. On time. Work ethic. Diligence. Initiative. Leadership skills. Problem solving. Perseverance. Self-discipline. Okay, are these things that a test can test? A standardized test? Are these things that a school can teach well? So the whole idea that somehow the College Board knows what college and career readiness really is kind of absurd. Because if you ask any people, they give you these answers. These are the intangibles. These are the character things. They really boil down to two things, wisdom and virtue. That's what people like in young people. So you young people, remember that, right? Go out there and demonstrate the character qualities, and you'll do fine. In fact, I've had a lot of people say, I don't care what education they have. I don't care what their skills are. Give me a person of good character. I can teach them the stuff they need to know to do this job, to learn this. But if they don't have the character, I can't teach that. And so, how do we do that? That's the question. That's the question I've been contemplating for many years, decades, and that is, how do you cultivate wisdom and virtue? How do you decide what to do and what not to do? The world of curriculum is too busy. Have you noticed this? It's just too overwhelming. It's worse than it was 20 years ago because there's all sorts of new options, which in a way is good, but it's so confusing. My wife never really liked to go to homeschool conferences. One reason is she didn't like to have a name tag with my last name on it and then have people, ask her questions about me. But she also had a problem with the exhibit hall, right? So you go in, and there's this one thing, and you look at it and think, oh, gosh, I totally failed to do that. You go to the next booth, you're like, oh, if only I were just organized enough to do that, and I would never have time to do that. And one circuit around 200 booths, she's coming to me saying, oh, do you think we should look for a good school or something? And then I have to give her therapy right there on the spot, and I'm too busy helping other people's wives. So, after a while, but so we kind of worked it out, and we just had to say, okay, we got to keep it simple. Curriculum has to be simple. If it's too complex, you get overwhelmed and you start to give up on stuff. So, 3 subjects: character, that's wisdom and virtue; knowledge, that's stuff you learn, it's all good; and skills. And that's basically your language skills and your math skills. So you can say, okay, is doing this going to help in these 3 areas? Is studying Latin going to build character? Probably, has the potential at least. Is it going to give knowledge? Yes, I would argue some of the most valuable knowledge. Is it going to develop skills? Yes, logical skills, language skills. So that's why to do Latin, right? Sailing. Let's say you said, oh, I've got a kid who just wants to go sailing all the time. Well, what if you let a teenager go sailing all the time? Would he develop character as a result of this? Sure, lots of very tangible. Would he develop knowledge? Yes, it'd be very specific, but it would be deep. Would he develop skills? Language and math skills? Probably so. Of course, GPSs make things a lot easier than in the old days when you had to learn to use a sextant. But so the thing about knowledge, though, is there's too much of it, right? I always think education must have been a lot easier 1,000 years ago because there's a whole lot less of everything. There's like 1,000 years less of history. There's a lot less literature. There was a whole lot less science to know. But see, it's all infinite, isn't it? Knowledge is infinite. You'll never know everything about everything. So don't even try. People say to me, I want to be sure I cover all the bases. My inward response is, woman, forget it. You do not want to cover all the bases, because if you did, even if you succeeded, that would be bad. Because you'd be a mile wide and a 1/4 inch deep, and as soon as summer hits, evaporation would set in, and it'd be all gone, and you know almost nothing about everything. It's better to go deep. Dig a chasm. Fill it with stuff, and then evaporation still sets in, but at least you know something about something. And, skills, that's how we apply the knowledge. So think about that. One of Oliver DeMille's 7 keys to great teaching is simple, not complex. So if you're ever feeling overwhelmed in your teaching, just the first question you ask is, how can I simplify? How can I simplify? Okay, number 6 is pretty short. You may not believe it, but I've learned this in 30 years. Teaching is actually all about you, not the students. It is. It's all about you. I mean, we think it's about the kids. It's like, oh, there's these kids, and we have to really, teach them, and it's all about them, and we get these child-centered curriculums and everything. But no, you're not going to be worth anything unless it's about you first, right? My friend Andrew Kern has a friend whose name I do not know, who has a friend who said something. So I would give credit to whoever said it, but probably they didn't even think of it. But I feel I've experienced it's true, and that is this. Teaching is the overflow from the soul of the teacher to the soul of the student. If you're not full, if you're not filling yourself continuously, it's very hard to overflow, whatever that is. Your capacity, may be greater or less. My capacity for Latin is very small, but I can still stay 2 steps ahead, and I can still overflow. And I think some moms forget this, and what they need to do is take a mini sabbatical, even for a day. Like, turn the tables on your kids. You get up, okay, it's homeschool, here's the checklist, everybody got to be doing their things. No. Go sit down on the couch, read a book. Kids are like, Mom, what are you doing? I'm studying. What? I'm studying. Leave me alone. Why? because I want to. Leave me alone. Aren't we like supposed to do school or something? You can if you want to. Well, what are you reading? You wouldn't be interested. Well, what is it? Tell us. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be interested, but if you would like to sit here quietly, you can draw pictures or play with Legos or whatever you want to do. I'll read it to you. Turn the tables, because what does that do? It creates the proper understanding, at least for a day, right? And then you fall into old habits, old behaviors. But if you're not filling yourself up, one of the things we say is inspire, not require. This is one of DeMille's 7 Keys of Great Teaching. How do you do that? It's easy to say to a kid, here's a checklist, do all this stuff or suffer a penalty. Or here's a checklist, do all this stuff and you get a bonus. But how do you inspire students to want to study and learn? I don't know all the tricks. If I did, all my students would be perfect. But I do know that that's the way, that's the path to walk. That's the path to walk. Last one is this, and everybody knows this, but you can't finish a talk on the really important things you've learned without mentioning the fact that teaching is all about love. Love is the absolute key to successful teaching. And I discovered this very early in my teaching. And I'm going to steal a tiny little bit from a longer talk called Teaching Boys and Other Kids Who Would Rather Be Making Forts All Day, and just finish with this, because I can tell this story any number of times, and I think people can hear it any number of times, and it always reminds me of the truth of things. The first one is you have to show that you love your students. I discovered this before I actually had kids. I was teaching violin, and I realized that if a student walks in, if that student knows that I love her, that I appreciate her, that I'm grateful that she's here and that grateful for the effort she's going to put out. If she knows that, things go a lot better. But when you're a 27-year-old violin teacher and you have a 13-year-old girl walking into your studio, you don't say, hey, sweetie, I am so glad you're here because I love you so much. No, you figure out other ways to communicate. So 2 things I learned. One, I learned, you've heard it before. I got it from Dr. Suzuki, my teacher, but with a twist. And that is the emotional bank account or the emotional gas tank. You've heard the idea. Because one of the hard things about teaching music is all about correction. As soon as someone picks up a violin, he's doing everything wrong. Everything. So it's a continuous process of correction. And nobody really likes that. Nobody likes a continuous correction. So you got to work around that somehow. So Suzuki's idea was that you would fill up your emotional bank account by saying positive things and doing positive things, and then live off the interest. Have enough in there that you can live off the interest. Well, when I was in Japan, it was the Carter years, and you could live off interest. It was like 12% or something. Now, what is it, like 1/8 of 1% in a money market? There's no interest. But in those days, so I thought, okay, 10%, there's a good ratio. So when I came back from Japan and started teaching, have a kid walk in, and I would intentionally try to say 10 positive things, and then I could live off the interest, right? And so I'd say, hey, thanks for being on time. I know how hard it is for my kids to get their mom anywhere on time, and I'm grateful that you're on time because that makes my life better. Hey, that's a cute blouse you got on. I don't know if it's a blouse. I still don't know what is a blouse. What is the difference between a blouse and a shirt? People have tried to explain this to me many times, but I'm too dense. Hey, your violin's clean. You must have polished it up. Maybe they didn't touch it all week. But it is clean. I'm not talking false praise. I'm just saying fine positives. I actually would count on my fingers. And the other thing I learned is the power of a smile. A smile is an amazing thing. Because if you just beam at someone long enough, they will smile back no matter what. Even if they're trying not to, they'll eventually crack up realizing how hard they're trying to not smile back. It communicates, I love you. I used to practice smiles in the mirror. I'd look and see, how's my smile look? And try different ones. Then I go try them on students. Don't do that anymore. The last thing that I would share with you is what happened to me when one of my daughters was about 8 years old. She was very close to me, really a daddy's girl kind of kid at that age. I was in the Spokane airport. My family was dropping me off, and I was going to fly to Boise and be gone for 6 days, right? And she just lost it. She just started to Daddy, do you really have to go away again? Because I miss you so much when you're gone. My heart ripped out. Yes, sweetheart, I do. I have to, because this is how I support us, and this is my job, and there's people expecting me. But wait a minute, Spokane, Boise, this is a cheap ticket. Hold on a minute, make a phone call. You want to come with me? Really? Sure. You can come with me. Mom's like, I said, no, we'll go to Walmart, and I'll buy some underwear and a toothbrush. I'm not totally incompetent here. So I took her with me, bought a ticket right there at the airport. And at that age, she was not much of a reader or writer, right? And she was in a class. I let her sit in the class with kids that were all at least a year or more older than she was. I didn't even know what she did. She might have done nothing but copy half a keyword outline for the whole 2.5 hours. I don't know. After that class, she went away with the family. I taught 2 more classes. I went to pick her up. And then as we're driving back to the hotel, I said, so how'd you like the writing class? And she said just like this, oh, Daddy, it was just wonderful. And I thought, ooh, I'm good. And then she said something just changed my life. She said, how come you're not like that at home? And I realized how easy it is for me to be unconditionally excited about, unconditionally appreciative of, unconditionally acknowledging of other people's children's efforts, and how easy it is to forget to be that way. It's like, yeah, you love me, I love you. We know this. So would you get to work? We have stuff to do. Gotta slow down. It's love is absolutely the key. And if you are lacking the capacity to love while you're teaching, just stop and fix that. Because without that, everything gets worse. Sometimes rapidly and sometimes irreversibly. So it's something I've known for years. I can't practice it perfectly. Nobody can. But it's the key. So those are the 7 points. I hope that they are useful. At least it's been mildly entertaining, I hope. So I thank you very much for being with me tonight and listening to my musings. God bless you. Thank you.